The International Monetary Fund says Zambia has signed a long-sought debt deal with its foreign lenders. The Southern African nation is the first country on the continent to default on loan payments after the COVID-19 pandemic. Earlier, I spoke to Humphrey Mulenga, a managing partner at audit and consulting firm Deloitte, for a breakdown on the IMF agreement. And this is how our conversation went.
So the debt is about $14 billion in total. That's external debt. And it comprises several creditors, including what is owed to the official creditors, which is about $6.3 billion. And that is a component that's the subject of the MOU that has just been signed in the past hour or two. The other component is owed to what are called private creditors. And that component will need to be discussed now that the first category has now been effectively backed.
So you talk about private creditors. Who are some of these private creditors? I'd imagine that the other half of the debt is obviously owed to the Bretton Woods institutions and similar. But who are the private creditors?
You're completely right, Hugo. So the private creditors are many, but the biggest chunk would be the bondholders. So if you go back maybe 10, 12 years ago, Zambia went into the debt market and borrowed from bondholders. This is the capital markets. And the total quantum of that debt is $3 billion. And there are three tranches of it. And these will be very diverse. Many of them will be based in the US, I would imagine, but also in Europe. So that is a major component of that private category, but also China, because some of the lenders from China are not necessarily government linked. They are private organizations, if you will. And that's another big chunk of that private component, Hugo.
So let's talk about exposure to the Chinese, because it always seems that the Chinese come in when the West fails and appear to be the savior of many African countries. But there always seems to be a catch to many of those arrangements. Are the structures, or certainly the arrangements with the Chinese, as transparent and as clear as one would like or one would expect?
That's been a big topic of discussion over the years, Hugo. And yes, there could be some improvement in the transparency. But actually, in the context of what Zambia has achieved, I would say the Chinese have actually come to the table much quicker than we thought. Of course, we'd have loved them to come much quicker, but actually they have supported this arrangement. If you look at what has been achieved here, I mean, a big chunk of that component is in fact owed to China. And they've agreed to participate and work with the Bretton Woods organization, the Paris Club, to reach an agreement. But also, the president was recently in China, actually, and we believe that off the back of that meeting, there will be some progress on the Chinese component of the debt as well.
So let's talk about the work that President Hichilema has done in seeking to restructure some of Zambia's debt. We do know that Zambia became Africa's first pandemic-era sovereign defaulter. So there was a lot of pressure, I'd imagine. And with that pressure would also come a huge amount of work of engagement and arriving to where we are today, where, from what we understand, certain MOUs have been signed.
Without a doubt. So remember that the country defaulted 3 years ago. I think it was back in November 2020. And since then, the country has been grappling to try and find a way out of this, this quagmire, if you will. And so, yes, since the new government came into post, they have been very disciplined, working with the IMF, because getting this deal was contingent on getting the house in order, so to say, which meant that they had to be more financially prudent, which they have been. If you look at the recent budget that was announced and looking at how they've performed the past 6 months, they've basically been on plan in terms of expenditure. They've also increased how much revenue is being earned from the domestic front, which is obviously important. But they've also taken some tough calls, including, dropping off some subsidies, whether it's in the power sector or in the fuel sector. So yes, financial discipline has been extremely important in ensuring that we remain on path to secure this deal that has been secured today.
So, Humphrey, when we talk about terms, they're obviously stringent terms, I'd like to imagine, to this MOU that has been signed, and I'm sure you'll walk us through some of those, or certainly those that you're aware of. But we come from a background where Zambia has defaulted previously. What is likely to change in this era of debt restructure that will ensure that Zambia does not default again?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So I guess the first thing I would say is that achieving this debt restructure gives the country a bit of wriggle room, some fiscal space, if you will. Because if you look at where we're coming from, something like 90% of the country's budget for finances were being spent on, public payroll, but also debt repayment, leaving only 10% for everything else, which meant that the Minister of Finance was really constrained as to what he could do. With this debt restructure, he will have a bit more cash in his coffers to apply on what is really important for the country, that is creating jobs and growing the economy. So that's really, really critical here. But going forward, clearly, the question will be, how do you ensure that you don't get into this trap again? And this is where discipline becomes really important. Fortunately, the country is working with IMF, and the IMF actually have really supported the government to ensure that they support them as best they can to get to a position of financial discipline. And the government has also played their role in that regard. And the hope is that that discipline will carry on going forward. And what this means is not borrowing at a rate that you can't pay back, ensuring that you don't borrow at very high rates. And the Minister of Finance have actually, they've actually confirmed that they only be borrowing at concessional rates. So yes, I think they've put in place a number of measures that will ensure that hopefully for the medium to long term, the country will remain financially sustainable.
A few months ago, the Kenyan President William Ruto was speaking on a global platform, and one of the things that he spoke about when it comes to African countries borrowing is that the fact that African countries who are in greater need than the West have greater difficulty to pay back many a time are borrowing at rates that are prohibitive, rates that are higher than the Western countries, for instance, would borrow from. Has this been a consideration? Are we expecting that the terms of reference are ones that are fair and obviously affordable for Zambia?
Yes, Hugo, that's really the big point here. So yes is a short answer, and to support that, what this debt restructure will entail is that the tenor of the debt will be extended by as much as 20 years, for example. And also there'll be some payment holidays. So for example, I think in the first 3 years, there'll be no principal repayments, but only interest, which gives a bit more, space in terms of leaving some resources for the country. But also the interest rates themselves, I believe, have been brought downwards to near zero in some cases. So these are now concession funds. So yes, this debt restructure answers to exactly that question, to ensure that the debt is sustainable, it's at a level that the country can afford.